So I took out a small mortgage to pay for this piece of cast iron that I've bought for the job, and I didn't really want to turn all of that thick slice into scrap chips, so I'm going to cut it off with a slitting saw, and I'm going to hold it down to the table with those two holes that I've marked out. At least that way I can use that slice for another job in the future rather than just being scrap. And with those holes drilled, I just need to get some pieces of all thread to hold it down to the bed. And there's the pieces of all thread threaded into some T-nuts, and you'll see I've already fitted the slitting saw. I had to experiment with that a bit to get the spacing right, and it was a good job that I had this set of spacers given to me with the mill, and I can make any combination of setups. Here's the first spacer lined up with the keyway and the key being fitted, and then the slitting saw, which is the biggest one I've got, and a few more spacers, and then the locking nut at the end. This is just showing how the piece of cast iron was held down to the table with just simple nuts and washers. And now you can see why I needed to mill two flats on the neck of the arbor, so that I could tighten everything down while holding it in the vise. This is it mounted back in the spindle, and I've just fitted the overarm. And here I've lined up the blade so that the curve of the cut is in the scrap part of the cast iron, and this is me beginning my cut. I couldn't go full depth straight away because I was fighting the stalling of the underpowered motor at that time. Even with my biggest blade, I wasn't going to make it all the way through that thickness of cast iron in one go. But as you can see here, I've sort of reached the limit. It's hitting the collars, and I've got just over halfway through. So now I'm going to have to flip it over and work from the other side. And here's me flipped over and ready to do the second side of the cut, lined up with the first, and I'm going down to about the depth where the first cut left off. And I've got these two hold downs at the front of the table just to keep everything square to the table and square to the cut. And here you'll notice that I've taken out the piece of all thread just so the collars can pass over it while the blade goes past, and then can reinsert it. And being as it was such a big blade, it did tend to wander off straight, but it's still saved a good chunk of metal for another project. I didn't show it, but I did dust off that face with a large milling cutter. You'll see that later on. Here I'm making my first cuts with the 60-degree bevel blade. I really wanted to check the blade was running true to the workpiece, or the workpiece to the blade, and it seems to be following the scribe line nicely. You can see here that I couldn't take a full length cut because this piece of cast iron is longer than the total travel of my table, so I'm having to do it in two sections where I cut as far as I can and then slide the workpiece down the table and continue cutting from there. It was at this point, where I was about 2/3 of the depth of the cut that I needed, that I noticed that the collar of the arbor was going to hit the other side of the cast iron. So I had to take a little side step and make an extra spacer collar and adjusting the table out so that the cutter met the original cutter in the cast iron. This is the milling cutter I used, 2.5 inch diameter, and it goes the full width of the cast iron in one go. And here it is dusting off the supposedly square factory cut. I took this footage because this is probably where I'm just about down to the final depth of the cut. You see me adjusting the knee up with my new car jack and locking off the knee at the back there, and just engaging the cutter with a decent amount of depth down to the scribe line, and working my way along very slowly. I should really fast forward this. At this end of the table, the gibs are really tight, and as you can see, it's taking me quite a bit of pressure to get the screw to turn. But as I get more into the centre of the work, things become a little bit easier. And I think it's time for some fast forward now, isn't it? Just out of shot there, you can see I've got the new 3/4 horsepower motor fitted, so it's so much easier when the motor doesn't keep on stalling in the cut, because there's a heck of a lot of blade engagement there. This is a shot of where I'm just down to the scribe line, so that's the end of my first cut, and time to flip it over. The second side was just a repeat of the first side, so I'm not going to bore you with that. Here you'll see the two big chunks of metal that I've got the cast iron bolted to keep it square to the table. This is a quick shot of how I get the arbor on and off the taper. Just using some number 3 wedges. Now to see if I got my maths correct, it's time for a test fit, and it looks good to me. You'll see that it does sort of sit off centre slightly, but that's the same as the dovetail on the vertical head. We'll have to do something about that factory end cut, because as you can see, it's not at 90 degrees to the sides. Well, I'll leave it there for now, and next time I shall be doing the top dovetail and finishing the whole project off.